All right, good morning to day 2. Thanks for being here at our session about personalized learning. I'll have our team introduce ourselves, but I want to start by saying that our session is really about interacting. It's called Defining Personalized Learning, and people usually really like definitions, but definitions become very simple, but what we're going to talk about is really complex. So we'll throw out some definitions, talk about some things, but know that, it's not simple. We're not trying to reduce it to that. So my name is Julie Kallio. I'm a graduate student here in the Ed Leadership program, and I'm studying leadership in personalized learning.
Hi, I'm Jerry Dreyer. I'm a graduate student here at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm a former high school teacher, and I'm studying acting and personalized learning.
I'm Curt Mould. I work with the Center Area School District, and I'm a permanent resident of UW-Madison. So I've been here forever, working through grad work and grad projects. I'm also working on leadership and personalized learning, but specifically through the lens of design.
Arlene Strikwerda. I come from elementary education and am now a grad student looking in structural practices.
I'm Tanu. I also a grad student in education leadership. I don't know why I mentioned that. I study technology and utilization of technology with regards to personalized learning.
Awesome, thank you. So our research group got together, I think it's 4 years ago at this point, and we work with Rich Halverson, who's a professor in ed leadership. And this thing called personalized learning was starting to be on everybody's radar in practice. And he saw the opportunity to say, okay, how can research come in and say, what is this? We were not interested in the sort of, does it work to improve test scores, or what is the right way to do it, or whose definition is best. We wanted to see what's actually happening in the field, because describing it as a first step to understanding why people are doing it. So we partnered with the Institute for Personalized Learning out of CISA 1, so they're over in Pewaukee. And they have a definition, so they are definitely more on the advocacy side, where they have their way of defining it that they're going to be working with. So it's an approach to learning and instruction. It's designed around individual learner readiness, strengths, needs, and interests. So it's starting with, you might hear words like student-centered, the teachers are facilitating. This is sort of the beginning of redesigning how learning is happening in the classroom. Another component is that learners are active participants. So rather than a delivery model, it's engaging students in being active, getting agency in their learning. And this last part is interesting because now it's starting to change some of the systems around in education. So looking at learning objectives, content, method, and pacing, but a whole lot more variability to that in terms of there's no kind of one way that people are doing it, but changing some of these structures in schools. So this is their definition of it. As we did our research, we found 3 other pieces of it that we added. One is about a culture of agency, so finding different ways at different levels to allow students to have agency and have teachers have agency. We also found that, and Arlene will talk a little bit more about this, how teachers were facilitating this and the routines that they were changing in their classroom. And then the last one is socio-technical ecosystems for technology. So how the different ways, and Tanu will be talking more about this, how people were integrating technology. Not that the technology was personalized learning, but that they were creating different ways of integrating technology into the learning process. So the way we're going to, and one more thing on this, I think one of the things that we struggled with early on was trying to understand how to think about personalized learning as a reform, and all the different ways people were talking about it. So on one side, there's the pedagogical and philosophical ways of talking about personalization. This kind of goes back to Dewey and thinking about experience. versus the more efficiency models of we have to figure out exactly how to time instruction to exactly what kids need to get them the furthest they can get. There's also pieces of the learning environment, so those are more of the structures that are put in place. And then there's also policies and programs around personalized learning. So like Vermont has a state policy that all schools should be personalized, all students should have a personalized learning profile. So there are policies that are involved in personalized learning, and there are also programs, specific components like with the Gates Foundation or the Summit platform. You might hear more of the sort of ed tech versions in that. So sometimes it's hard to compare. Excuse me. This is Charlie, by the way. Charlie's 2 months. He might contribute a little bit here to the presentation. Sometimes when we were comparing these, it was hard to talk about encouraging agency, but then also versus like a computer adaptive testing or computer adaptive technology. So thinking about how those different components of personalized learning may or may not be comparable if they're kind of in these different categories. All right, so the way we're gonna run the session, each of us is gonna give a little pitch on the different topics that we've been researching. And then we're gonna break up into small groups. You'll have a chance to talk with it's sort of like Ed Camp style. We'll do 15 minutes for a first session and another 15 minutes for a second session. So you'll get to talk on participate in 2 of these topics, if that makes sense. So we'll kind of break up into small groups. Those, we'll kind of kick off those 15 minutes with a little bit of sort of prompting, but then really we want to hear your questions and what you're interested to learn from the research that we've been doing. So we'll give kind of a 2-minute pitch that for what we're going to talk about, and then we'll break up into groups. All right. Okay. Arlene.
I'm Arlene. I'm interested in teacher practices, instructional strategies, and I'm at the point where I've done my research, I've turned in my draft, I'm waiting for feedback. So I looked at the personalized learning schools, not because that's the only place it's happening, but because I could really see a lot of things happening. I was interested in locations where students were really involved in their learning and were developing as learners. And in this study, I was able to see that happening. So when I went to look at what practices teachers were actually using, I did 2 studies. One of them was to look at the participation structure, the relationship of teachers and students. So that's one piece I'm going to talk about or share with you. And then the second one, what are the practices and how do they function to help students develop as learners? So those are the 2 ways I looked at the data that we gathered looking at 12 different schools. And in my 2 studies, the first one I looked at elementary schools, the second one I looked at schools across K-12. So that's what I'm sharing.
I'm Curt. I already talked about who I am. But a big part of my work with PIP was to get after those initial characteristics of personalized learning. And my day job creates affordances for me to actually put some of those ideas and concepts into place. So a part of that is restructuring and redesigning current facilities to remove constraints to do personalized learning. And that is everything from reconfiguring spaces to create maker spaces to blowing holes in walls so that kids have greater flow of movement and interactivity in spaces where co-teaching takes place, all the way up through designing brand new elementary schools that will open in about a week and a half from now. So, taking the ideas of personalized learning and then sitting down with architects and saying, okay, if you were to take these concepts and these elements of design, how do you actually build a structure around them to allow that? But then to also do so in a way that future-proofs our building. So challenging the wisdom of building single solution buildings that only have one purpose that cost millions and millions of dollars when in 50 years from now our population may decline and we might have to liquidate those assets. And so how do you design facilities that can have multiple functions and multiple purposes and meet the needs of kids today? So on all of the thinking and design elements that went into place with that.
Awesome. So I'll talk about leadership. So looking specifically at the role of principals, instructional coaches, assistant principals in changing the structures, kind of the learning environment, and how that provides agency for teachers to then provide agency for students. And so really looking at how they're using the voices of what teachers and students are asking for and integrating that into the design of the school schedule, the design of proficiency-based pathways, the design of the physical spaces. So looking at that role of leadership in shifting to a more personalized system.
I'm interested in kind of the intersection of equity and personalized learning. Obviously, you can look at, or you can, the biggest problems in schools right now is equity, right? And you can slice that across race or socioeconomic status or gender or sexual orientation or all kinds of things. We can kind of predict outcomes based on those, which is problematic. So I think that any kind of initiative or reform, like and personalized learning is a big one, and I think a really important one, needs to address those problems. Those are the primary problems of education. So I guess I have a lot of questions about how it might do that. I don't think there is any really strong evidence either way right now. So how might we figure out if it does that, or how can we design personalized learning to address those problems? To be more
Wait, I'm done. I study the role of technology within personalized learning settings, and what we found my work is, one, how does technology play in, and then two, what is the relationship between personalized learning and the use of technology within schools. So in the first part, we found that there are four major uses of technology, and that it's either used as a productivity enhancement tool or like an information gathering tool. So students and teachers use Google's Suite or Microsoft Office applications and stuff like that to still do the kind of work that they would be doing in a non-personalized environment, but those activities just make it more efficient. And then we found computer adaptive learning or some kind of curriculum design that was across in our study, which allows students to learn competencies and kind of help the teacher in being able to work with the student but not have the complete responsibility on the teacher. And the third thing that we found, which was rarer but much more exciting, was the presence of digital media spaces that fostered creativity within student groups. That was the first part. And my personal interest then went into what is the role of technology within personalized learning environments. And so I tried to explain that technology isn't really the driving force, but it is definitely a very pervasive tool that is present in all these settings that we observed. And so I came up with a 2x2 graph that shows the relationship between personalized learning on horizontal axis and technology and vertical axis to explain that. And I'm happy to talk about that more in our 15-minute group.
All right, so we're going to turn to small groups, and maybe if each of us could take a corner of the room and one group in the middle. When we stand up, we kind of move chairs to whoever you would like to talk to. And just again, you'll get a chance to go to two. We're going to do 15 minutes with one person, and then we'll switch to 15 minutes, and then we'll kind of come back together to debrief at the end. All right, as Jerry is putting up our email addresses, in case you would like to contact us for more conversation or other things. We'll all kind of hang out in the room if you want to talk to other people you didn't get to talk to, but I want to make sure you're on time for the next session. So thank you guys so much for being with us today and engaging in those discussions about the complexities of this reform, and certainly we love hearing from you what you're thinking about, so be in touch.
What's the name?